Yeah, I'm Phillip Harder. I am currently Research Director with Croptimistic Technology, which is sort of SWOT maps, so precision ag, variable rate, soil-based kind of zone delineation. But previous to this, I was at the University of Saskatchewan for many years, and so my background is actually hydrology. So focused largely on, at the end of it all, looking at agriculture, hydrology, ag-water interactions, with kind of the overall premise of, in the prairies, especially here, we are water limited most of the time. So what can we do to manage that one component, which is often determined to be uncontrollable? So what can we do to make our farming more stable in terms of productivity? I did, if you want to get into the nuances of it, when you do a PhD, you can take everything and make it super complicated. So I really focused on what was the impact of stubble on snowmelt. So if you want to talk snowmelt and stubble, I won't go too far down that road today, but we can if you want.
Did you publish the big article on stripper stubble then? Is that you?
When? I didn't. I haven't published anything specifically on stripper stubble, but it's part of the, that's the fun endpoint of snow management. So I'm not going to take that call. Where are we at here? Okay, so so I guess when I was asked to come talk about ag and water, that was a while ago here, and we were all talking about drought because everything was dry for the last couple of years. And then we come here now, and it rained this morning, and it was calling for rain this afternoon, but I think we're going to be okay for now. And we're clearly in a different boat, right? So there have been some sheets handed out. You can look at a neighbor, but I pulled out the data from sort of your local Met station. I believe it's the one over yonder here, not that far away. So where are we actually at in terms of our water to date this year? And as a hydrologist, I don't just look at the growing season precipitation. I like to look at the water year precipitation. So typically October 1st to September 30th, because what happens in winter does actually matter. And so if you go back to our water year precipitation and you look on the graph, 2024 is the lighter blue line or so, but it's the one that's clearly above our long-term average, which is pink. So it has been, it started off the water year, everything's kind of low. Wintertime is generally not the time that water accumulates significantly in this area. Your water typically comes in springtime. But southern prairies are amongst the most extreme climate that we have successful agricultural production in, that often relies on, say, dryland, for example. We have a huge variation in annual precipitation. Averages don't really mean anything beyond where, kind of to tell us where we kind of are relatively. It's good for context, doesn't really mean anything in practice. So right now, it seems like it's been really wet, but it's in the context of the last 4 years, which have been also super dry. Like we're not, I had an error. I think I was talking to you yesterday, Ken, and I said we're like at the annual. No, there was an error in the data. And I looked at it last night, I was like, yeah, you guys didn't have 80 mils yesterday or something. So I adjust my my figure. But we're above average right now, but not very, right? And so that's because we had a lot that came earlier in the year. So typically June is supposed to be a really wet month. There's only been an inch of water according to that weather station in June. It came earlier than that. So, and obviously, the story that we've had a lot, especially, so I'm coming from Saskatoon, and it's very much the same boat as here, where it's like, oh, it's been a cool spring. It's been cold, we haven't really, we're all wearing jackets. Maybe we can take them off by the end of this talk if the sun keeps coming out. Maybe not. But it seems, oh, it's cool. everything's slow. But if you look at our growing degree days, so it's the heat accumulation over time, this is sort of what is really what matters in terms of, say, crop growth. Look on that bottom graph. So pink is our average, lighter blue is 2024. I can't pick it out because it's on average. We're not actually that much hotter or that much cooler than where we've been than normal conditions. We're just dealing with last year it was super warm. So this seems really cool, but we are average. So end of story, where are we at right now? We came out of some pretty intense droughts. I know what it looked like in Saskatoon area. I don't want to do that again. But what we are in right now is normal weather, normal temperatures, and wetter. And so what this really does favor is very efficient water use. So we have available water because it's in their soils, and we don't have huge evaporative demand relative to last year when things were, 30 for an entire month early in the season. So what I'm talking about, it really dovetails with a lot of the other speakers that have come before me. So I don't think we could just wrap it up now and just say, listen to what they said. But yeah, in this environment, you have these short windows of opportunity to grow stuff. And we don't know when it's gonna be. Our weather modeling is not good enough to say, this is the premium time for this season, you need to plant at this date, and then you're gonna be good to go. So it's all kind of by the seat of our pants, but at the same time, let's try and set up our systems to be most appropriate, to give us that 8 out of 10 years we have the most success. Because there's always gonna be a curveball. So, things like Brian's early seeding, that's really what we're pushing, as he was pointing out, pushing our crop growth into our low stress environments, because that's really quite important. So I did a bunch of work at one point. This is all going to be based on Saskatoon kind of information. It is not quite as extreme of an environment here, but there's always been this talk of, crop water use efficiency. So how much water is needed to produce a bushel of grain or whatever. So water use, or crop yield divided by water use. This is sort of this metric. And there's a lot of discussion around, different crops have different water use coefficients. Well, what about different varieties or treatment practices? And so we did a study, and we were looking at measuring this with what we would call eddy covariance. So we're not taking soil moisture depth profiles to figure out how much water is removed from a landscape. We're basically using a tool to get sort of field average perspective on what's going on in terms of carbon assimilation and water use. And the one thing that we found quite quickly in that is that water use efficiency is actually relatively quite conservative. It remains fairly similar throughout, within species is what we were kind of factoring in. And so we had 6 years of barley data, for example, and 5 of those years, we have the exact same water use efficiency. We have different outcomes because at the end of the day, it was the amount of water that's available. We had 1 year, 2021, which was horrifically hot for a week in Saskatoon area, where it just killed the crop off, and we had some really weird water use efficiency, but that was a scenario where we were out of the bounds of comfort, clearly for that barley, and it died from heat stress. So that's a fun outlier for scientific purposes, but not great for crop production. Long story short, water use efficiency, it really comes down to how much water is available. And as a hydrologist, I want to figure out where the water is coming from, where it's going, and how much is available in the meantime. And so what I got Farming Smarter to do when they asked me to come, and they said, what could be a fun demo? Well, I said, well, let's look at root depth, for example, and how that varies. And so we got 2 sites here. So we got lentils, and we've got wheat. So these are very different crops in terms of rooting patterns, water use, phenology in general. And they did instrument these sites. And so if I am led to believe correctly, I think there's probes. There's a 20 centimeter and a 40 centimeter probe depth somewhere in here, in our lentils, and in the wheat beside it. And so controlling for, this is a fairly uniform soil. Let's just say we're only 5 meters apart. And you can look at on the second figure here, second page, what are the time series of soil moisture. And so unfortunately, there's a problem with the 20 centimeter probe in the lentils because problems happen when you start measuring things. And so we don't really have much to say about that beyond both of those crops early on after planting, we saw a very sharp decline. So we had a wetter condition, things planted, it's early in the season. So what we're actually seeing there is a lot more of our soil evaporation. That's what's occurring. So our red line is our lentils. It's dropping fairly fast. It has a different starting point. And largely that's going to be coming down to, as soon as you start having your surface, your crops growing a little bit, this is getting into micrometeorology, you get a little bit of displacement of your wind, you have a reduction of soil evaporation at your surface. So what really is driving water movement from our surface to our atmosphere? It comes down to energy and diffusion. So if it's sunny, we have energy from the sun that is able to, drive that phase change of water from a liquid to a gas. When we have dry conditions, we have a very high gradient in our water vapor between a saturated surface and a dry atmosphere. And if things get windy, those things mix faster. So if you have more energy, so heat, sunlight, that increases our evaporation rates. If we have dry air, that increases our evaporation rates. And if it gets windier, it increases our evaporation rates. So in Lethbridge, where it's hot, dry, sunny, and windy, you have incredibly high evaporation rates. And so when you have a small, short crop like this, you have a lot more air that is able to interact with your surface, and so you will have higher evaporation rates than in our wheat. If you were able to successfully invent a wind speed sensor that you could deploy into your crop, you would see very large differences in the amount of wind speed. But I don't know, a 3-cup anemometer you can't shove into a crop because it tends to hit the leaves. So it's kind of a very complex thing to do. So we've got this data. The other thing to kind of pull out from this is, well, where are our crops drawing water from? So we talk about rain as being really important for our crops, but really crops don't use rain. They use the water that's in the soil because that's where the roots are. Same thing with any sort of like nutrients. We were talking about foliars, I think, yesterday. And I was like, what works better? Well, when the nitrogen gets into your soil, because that's where it is able to effectively uptake. Plants don't really pull water through their leaves. So we have had about an inch of rain in the last month, and there's a figure kind of on the top which kind of shows the timing of that. Kind of that lines up with the x-axis, the dates on the figures below. And so we clearly saw there's a decline early on, and then there was a larger rainfall event, about 15 or 17 millimeters there, and we saw a response in our lentils, but we didn't really. So at the 40 centimeter mark, our lentil soil moisture actually increased a little bit, while our wheat clearly was still decreasing. So this is kind of what it can tell you very quickly is that clearly the soil is able to absorb the water to a certain amount, but where does it go? So because the lentils are not as deeply rooted, that water's going down, we're going to recharge to depth, while our wheat is more aggressively using our water. It has a larger rooting system, is able to access more of that. So the one kind of not very exciting conclusion of a lot of my work in looking at ag-water interactions is that from a water balance perspective, in this environment, plants will use the water that's available. How much water does a plant use? What's there? So how do you figure out how do you increase what's there is basically, the subsequent question. And so it's not only is what there, it's how much it can access. So, for fun, because we need to dig stuff, anyone want to dig a hole for me? You do. Okay. I'm assuming it's okay for us to dig up plants? Okay. Dig me a hole.
Just that?
Just dig.
All right.
You find me at the bottom of the roots. Sorry. And we're timing. Yeah. Just sit back. Drink my coffee. There we go. So, a lot of the time when we talk about and I missed Len's talk this morning. By the sounds of it, I should have been here, unfortunately. But just because our surface tells us one thing, sometimes means absolutely nothing with respect to what happens below. Because there's a bit of it's a bit of a mystery sometimes. And so, we have this soil here, we've got this rooting structure, but and it rained this morning as well. So yesterday has sort of been a little bit more descriptive when it was a little bit drier. But do you think you found the bottom of the roots?
I think so.
How far are we?
I feel like it was right away. Down there?
Yeah, so we got roots there.
Keep going?
Keep going. I need a nice clean face.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a couple things also with this. So how would you characterize your soil texture? What do you call it here? Anyone? Clay loam? Which is a lovely soil type if you want to hold water because you've got a large soil water holding capacity. So if you look at, I threw a figure in here as well. And of course it was wet on the table, so now my paper's gonna fall apart. So there's this figure here. And there's all sorts of different ways of representing it. Okay, we're getting serious.
I knew you'd say something.
But, so, and I don't know, we don't need to go back to the trauma of doing soil physics in undergrad or anything like that. But every soil type has a different water holding capacity, just different water holding characteristics. And so clay loam on here, it's on the y-axis, we've got basically what's the proportion by volume. So a 0.5, that means half of your volume is the area, the volume that's taken up by it. So for a clay loam, we are looking at a wilting point, so the water content where plants can't access it anymore, around 0.17, and our field capacity is up to 0.35 or so. And then our porosity, so the amount of water, if it was fully saturated, is getting up to 0.5. Key thing to remember in this is that there is a large shaded area that goes with those. So just because you know your soil texture doesn't tell you everything. So this is where we have the space for, conversations around organic matter. What's the cropping history? This is a space where sometimes people start talking about biologicals or adding things like that in terms of what is describing some of that variance. So the key component, though, is when you want to have a healthy crop, you want to have the largest water holding capacity. So that's where you want to find a spot on this graph where you have the largest range between our field capacity and wilting point. And so this is where we generally end up in the loams. Loams are the good stuff. But every soil has a different characteristic. Okay, where are we at? I don't know.
Where do you want to be?
That's I think good. So the other fun part, and this should be, I think by now everyone's knows a little bit about soils. So this is one of our nice dark brown. Are we dark brown here? We're not black. Dark brown Chernozem? Yeah. It's looking more darker brown to me today. It's wet. So even though we have a nice, on the surface everything looks uniform, there's clearly variation, and our surface tends to be the most active biologically. That's where we have the largest water holding capacity, the most organic matter. And we can see when we look in here, not that you can, but I can, our root depth is getting down to about 20 centimeters. And then below that, we get into this, not nearly as nutrient rich, our parent materials, which is really good for providing that subsoil moisture that gets us through. But the surface is where all the fun stuff happens with our nutrients. And, a lentil in this example, we're only going down 20 centimeters. So after all that work, do you want to do a wheat hole? Or do you need another volunteer? Who can do or you can use the auger if you want on the table. But I can't see the roots very well then. Okay, so yeah, head into the wheat and dig me a hole. Yeah, go further in. We don't want any edge effects. They said we could dig holes, so yeah. We're getting serious now. Lost my train of thought now. Okay, so we often talk about, in season. We talk about rainfall. We talk about soil moisture. And this is how it's going to be characterizing what's going on in a year.
Using the shovel.
You're using the shovel? It's more illustrative if you use the shovel. Oh, there we go.
I was layered up.
You were. He's the warmest one here, just so you all know. So the thing about agriculture and hydrology is that anytime you do anything on your surface, you are impacting your hydrology. You are drying out your surface, you are changing its infiltration capacity, all those things. And also, what actions you take one year have implications further along for the next. And so I'm going to try drawing, and this is always going to turn out badly. But, so if we have, this is just our surface, and let's just talk about crop rotation. So year one, we've got lentils. Year two, let's call it wheat. What do we want for the next? Canola. Let's keep it nice and simple. So we're going to go with 3 years only, because I'm going to run out of space. So when we talk about, so we have our growing seasons, and then we have winter, and then we have a growing season again. So what's our rooting depth on a lentil? Shallow. Sorry? 50 centimeters. Depending on the year, depending on the soil type, but yeah, we're talking about 50 centimeters. And so this is all going to be very qualitative, but our rooting depth gets down to 50 centimeters, and then we harvest, rooting depth disappears, we have wintertime, we have no cover crops. No, didn't get any laughs from the cover crop folk. Okay, sorry. Then we have wheat. How far does wheat go down? It depends on yours. What? Depends. I've been seeing 1.2 to 1.5. It depends on the year, but let's say we get down to here, and then we get harvest, and our canola. Well, how deep does our canola get? We are in the prairies, and I don't know who's successfully pulled off a winter canola. Anyone? We'll keep it local. It's about 1.2. If anything, it's going to be slightly less than our wheat. So,
It kind of depends on moisture, doesn't it?
it can, and where the moisture is and all that kind of stuff. So this year, because everything was dry to start off with, our moisture is focused on the surface. So it's unless we have lots of redistribution of moisture to depth, which depends on your soil type, the vast majority of water will remain near the surface, especially if it's growing at the same time the water's coming. Yeah. So the other challenge, so when we grow, and let's just assume everything is kind of similar underneath, clearly this is going to use the least amount of water and leave the most water for the next year. And if our wheat is able to access it, we are going to have our yield bump rather than if it was just wheat on wheat. Same thing with canola. But wheat and canola, very similar. You could have, depending where you are in rotation, canola, if it's a good year, we probably want more canola than wheat. So maybe think about which way you could do your rotation there. The other challenge, and this is one of these things where it kind of erases some of these differences, is that our lentils, it does not grow very tall. And when we harvest, we get nothing remaining in terms of stubble height. A lentil field is nice and clean. It's basically the modern day equivalent of fallow. And so this is where your wintertime processes are really important. So no one likes snow, and I've heard so many times people refer to, rain makes grain, and then we forget about snow. And that's fine if we didn't have snow, but we have snow. Lethbridge snow is a little different than Saskatoon snow. I will give you that. But when we have stubble that's left behind, we have snow retention. So after a lentil year, we are not going to have very much snow. It's going to blow off, essentially. After a wheat year, it grows, and if we're feeling optimistic, or if we are thinking about our snow management, 5 minutes. Okay. I was like, you have a question?
He's still digging, right?
To be honest, I did actually forget for a moment. Have you found the bottom of the roots?
I think so.
Where are they?
At the bottom.
At the bottom?
Good answer.
So that hole looks like 40 centimeters to me. So,
I think I'm going to stick to research.
I got a tape measure.
yeah,
From BDO,
I'm sure. Yeah, I feel like to finish this point, we'll hold off on that one. Okay, so when we have wheat stubble that's left behind and we don't harrow it under and we don't mow it down to as low as we can get when we combine, we can actually retain a bunch of snow. And depending on our conditions, that can actually infiltrate quite well. So the last 3 years previous to this one, we had excellent snow conditions, especially in the Saskatoon area. So we had a lot of snow and it all infiltrated. Springtime, we had no runoff. People are like, oh, there's no water. The snow didn't amount to anything. Well, it's because you didn't see it. It all just went in. And so we had a lot more snow available that could go in for our canola to be used the next year. Canola, very similar. So when we look at our rotations, we have these sort of antagonistic things, right? So our lentils, we don't have very good snow retention, but we also don't use a lot. We leave a lot behind. In contrast, our wheat, we use a whole lot more, but we potentially have more snow retention and infiltration that comes in the springtime. And so we have these kind of things that balance each other out. And it's really hard to, know which one to predict because it depends on the year. So this last year we had all these midwinter melts. That is not very good for infiltration come springtime, especially if you have an ice layer on the surface. And so that's where you kind of end up with potentially lots of spatial variability in your runoff. So that's kind of the fun aspects of how we have rotations that can interact with our different hydrological processes to give us very different outcomes that we have to kind of think about sometimes. So where I'm at now, so we look at this field and these two holes are going to be very similar in terms of their soil properties. But we have a lot of variability over a landscape. And this is not a sales pitch, but the point of it being that, in the last picture on the end there, we have some understanding now where we can start mapping things like soil water holding capacity, depending on the different tools that you have available to you. And so that's going to be, when we want to talk about our ag-water interactions, the fundamental thing we need to know is how much water is available. How big is the tank that we can draw water from? And so we're getting to the point now with the tools that we have to start, how much water is used. We can interpret our soil moisture information. And we have yield mapping data, so we can start getting ideas on how does the water use efficiency vary over a field, for example, and go from there. But I think I'm going to stop there. You have a question?
Yeah. Where do you see winter crops being in this with your water use and a limited water? Do you think advantage, no disadvantage, like kind of the same?
Winter crops, it's kind of like following along with what Brian was kind of talking about yesterday. Like there are significant water advantages with respect to winter crops because you're starting your growth earlier in those times of the year where you are in less water stress. Conditions are more conducive to taking advantage of the water you have. The challenge with winter crops is sometimes they have been planted into, you don't have the stubble to the same extent. So if you're able to say plant into standing stubble, because there's a lot of microclimate advantages to planting into standing stubble, reducing your wind speed, reducing evaporative demand, reducing soil evaporation, leaving more water for your transpiration. So there is a big advantage there. Ideally you do both. You have a standing stubble that you can plant your winter crops into. But yeah. And that's the other fun thing about cover crops is there's often been arguments against using cover crops because they use up all your water and there's none left over. There's a bit of a non-linearity in this though, because depending on your year, if you have a dry fall or if you have a wet fall and your cover crops are there and they use up the water, you now have a drier surface that is much more conducive to infiltrating whatever snowmelt could occur. So sometimes those things cancel themselves out as well. There's been some work done as well, kind of on the opposite extreme for that. So sometimes people fall irrigate to, say, recharge their soil moisture. But you end up with a saturated surface, which can promote runoff of any snow that occurs and actually will increase your evaporation. I can't remember which way it goes. Either way, you can actually have a net decrease in your soil water storage if you have a weird winter and fall irrigation. So it's not always straightforward. Hydrology, at the end of the day, hydrology is nonlinear. Expect the unexpected.
That's a great note to end on.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Phillip.